My name is Anna de Arma, and I'm 27 years old. 5 years ago, my parents sold my grandmother's house, the one that was supposed to be mine, and lied about where the money went. They didn't tell me they were selling it. They didn't ask my permission, though I was legally an adult and my name was on the deed. They simply did it, pocketed the money, and constructed an elaborate narrative about why the sale never happened. They thought I would never find out. They thought I would never come home again after I left for law school. They thought wrongly that distance and silence would keep their secret safe, until the day it all came back to them in a way they couldn't escape, through me, standing in a courtroom, with the power to make them tell the truth. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the person I was before everything broke, because that girl is important. She's the one who made me understand why my parents did what they did, and more importantly, she's the reason I survived what came after. I was the quiet one, the invisible one. While my older sister Monica was performing in school plays and winning debate competitions, I was reading in the corner, writing in journals, teaching myself how to read contracts from my father's law library when I was 11 years old. Monica was the golden child, charismatic, confident, the kind of person who could walk into a room and change its energy. She had my parents' full attention, their praise, their endless interest in her trajectory. My parents loved her the way people love stories they can't put down. I loved my parents the way I loved math, quietly, systematically, trying to find the pattern that would finally make me visible to them. I was trying to solve an equation where the variable was their love, and nothing I did seemed to change the outcome. The difference between Monica and me wasn't about talent or ambition, it was about the kind of attention we demanded. She demanded it constantly in bold letters. I was waiting for it to arrive on its own, as though deserving something was enough to receive it. Spoiler alert, it never is. Our grandmother, Abuela Carmen, was different. She saw me. She had seen me since I was small when I would sit with her on her porch in the house, the one that matters to this story, and listen to her tell stories about being an immigrant from Argentina, about building a life from nothing, about understanding what it meant to be underestimated and overlooked. Mija, she would say, running her fingers through my hair, the world will miss you while it's looking at everything shiny and loud. But the quiet ones, the observers, we build the things that last, we are the architects. She meant it literally too. She ran her own real estate business for 40 years. When Abuela Carmen was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, I was 22. I was in my final year of undergraduate studies, pre-law, and absolutely certain I was going to prove something to my parents through ambition and achievement. I remember sitting in her hospital room, watching her hands shake as she signed documents with her lawyer. I remember her looking at me and saying, "This house, Anna, when I'm gone it becomes yours. It's the only thing I have that matters. Not because of money, but because it's roots. It's proof that we were here." She died 3 months later. I gave a eulogy that I had rewritten 9 times, trying to find the words that would make my parents finally look at me the way Abuela had. I didn't find them. But Monica sat in the front row, perfect in black, crying at exactly the right moments, and I watched my parents comfort her, my parents pour their grief into her. The house should have been mine. Legally it was mine. Abuela's will was clear. I was the executor and the sole beneficiary of her estate. I didn't move into it immediately. I went to law school instead, and the house sat there, gathering dust and meaning in equal measure. It was my anchor. It was my proof that I mattered, that I was chosen by someone. My parents asked to access it for small repairs. I said yes. They asked if they could speak to some contractors about improvements they thought Abuela's property needed. I said yes. I was feeding them access like I was feeding them ammunition, and I didn't even know it. This was before I understood that giving people trust is like giving them a loaded gun, and hoping they won't point it at you. Monica was struggling. This was the narrative my mother began to present to me, carefully and with practiced sympathy, during my first year of law school. Monica's business was failing. Monica had made some bad investments. Monica needed help, and the family needed to figure out how to support her. It wasn't directly stated at first, it never is, but the implication was clear. I should use the house, sell it, give her the money, prove I was a good sister. I said no, and for that I was labelled selfish. I remember the exact phone call with my father. I was in my tiny apartment in New York, and it was 2:47 a.m. and he called because he knew that's when I was still awake, studying for con law. He said, "Your mother is extremely disappointed in you." Just that. Not that he was disappointed, but that mother asterisk was, as if his feelings couldn't exist without mediation. as if he needed her to feel on his behalf. I said, "I'm sorry you feel that way." And he said, "The house was supposed to be family. Abuela would have wanted to help Monica." And I said something I've replayed 10,000 times since. Abuela left the house to me, not to Monica, and I'm going to keep it. That decision, that one sentence, cost me my family for the next 4 years. I didn't know it at the time, but my parents and Monica were already moving forward with their plan. They had a realtor. They had a price. They had a buyer. All they needed was time and the expectation that I would eventually crack, eventually visit, eventually discover that they had already sold my future without my consent. I discovered it exactly the way they feared I would, by checking property records. It was March 15th, 2020. I was sitting in the library during my second year of law school, and I was procrastinating on a property law assignment by obsessively checking property tax information online, because I'm weird and I liked understanding how buildings and ownership actually worked. And there it was, in plain public record. The house had been transferred to a third party on November 8, 2019, for $487,000. Money that, as far as I could tell, had disappeared into my parents' accounts. The worst part wasn't the sale itself. The worst part was the silence that followed. The lie that had been constructed was that the sale had never happened. When I called my mother and asked her about it, she said, "Sweetheart, I don't know what you're talking about. The house is still in the family's name. Maybe there's a clerical error." And when I explained what I had found when I pulled up the records and read the deed transfer to her, there was this moment of pause, and then she said, "Well, we were going to tell you, but we wanted to protect you." Protect me, that's the word they used. I called 14 times over the next 5 days. The first 3 went to my mother's voicemail. By the 4th call, my father's number was blocked. I sent 2 emails. My mother responded to the first with, "We can discuss this when you're ready to have a reasonable conversation," despite the fact that my email had been entirely reasonable, entirely documented, entirely devastated. I sent a handwritten letter to their address. My mother returned it unopened with a note that said, "This relationship needs time to heal." Time, as if time could heal something that wasn't being honestly addressed. What I did instead of breaking was something that surprised me. I went to class. I sat in Professor Weinstein's property law course, and I took notes about transfers of title and adverse possession, and what it meant to own something versus what it meant to have a claim to something. And something shifted in me during that lecture. Some crucial machinery that had been rusted started moving again. I realized that my parents had made a legal mistake. They had transferred a property that wasn't solely theirs to transfer. They had committed what, in certain circumstances, could be considered fraud or theft. I had been trained to understand the law. I had been trained to argue. I had been trained to see the architecture of how things were built and how they could be dismantled. I just hadn't been trained to use those skills against my own family yet. Professor Weinstein saw me after class. She was a woman in her early 60s, sharp as a scalpel, with silver hair she wore short and this way of looking at you that made you feel like she was seeing your entire future at once. "You looked like you were solving something," she said. I didn't answer, but I probably looked like I was about to cry, because she invited me to her office and she made tea and I told her everything. I told her about the house, about Monica, about the 4 years of slow, invisible suffocation that had preceded this one act of economic violence. She listened, and then she said, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I said. "They're my parents." "Yes," she said, "and you have legal recourse, and a future that has nothing to do with their choices. Those 2 things can both be true." That conversation saved my life, not because it told me what to do, but because it told me I had agency, that my choices mattered, that the house was gone but the law wasn't, and my capacity to understand it wasn't, and neither was my future. Weinstein became my mentor. She introduced me to a lawyer who handled restitution cases. She showed up to my graduation from law school, even though she didn't have to, and she took me to dinner afterward and told me I was going to be formidable. She meant it, and it meant everything. I built my own life. I got a job at a criminal justice advocacy firm in Brooklyn. I took on cases about inheritance, fraud, and elder abuse. I became the kind of lawyer who sat across from people who had been stolen from, and I helped them recover what they could. I learned how to be precise with anger. I learned how to turn pain into precision. I did not contact my parents. They did not contact me. Monica I gathered through the small world of social media and mutual acquaintances, was still performing, different venue, same script. She had used the money from the house sale to fund a business venture that had also failed, and she was now reinventing herself as a wellness coach. The cycle continued, but it no longer had me in it. And then, 4 years after the day I learned the truth, everything collided. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was in the office preparing for a fraud case when I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something in me recognized the area code. My hometown area code. It was a hospital administrator. Monica had been admitted to the psychiatric ward at our hometown hospital. She had attempted suicide. My mother was listed as emergency contact, but my mother had collapsed. My father was with her. And apparently, according to Monica's own statement during intake, she wanted me to know what had happened. I sat at my desk for a long time after that call. My colleague asked if I was okay, and I said yes, which was a lie. I was not okay. I was standing at the edge of something I had spent 4 years building walls to avoid, the possibility that my family needed me, that crisis could undo the distance I had constructed, that showing up now could erase everything I had done to protect myself. I got on a plane that night. I didn't decide to do it in any rational way. My body just made the decision and my mind followed along. The hospital was the same hospital where Abuela had died. I walked through the doors and the smell hit me first, that specific combination of institutional disinfectant and human grief, and it brought everything back. The loss, the invisibility, the moment I realized I would have to save myself because no one else could do it. Monica was in a private room and she looked smaller than I remembered. Mental health crisis does that to people. It strips away the performance and leaves you with just the basic shape of a human. She was on a 72-hour psychiatric hold. She had been making increasingly erratic financial decisions. The wellness business had been a front, and she was hemorrhaging money. She had been living a lie so elaborate, so exhausting, that eventually the lie had collapsed. "I didn't know if you would come," she said when she saw me in the doorway. She said it in a small voice, a voice I had never heard from her before, a voice without performance or strategy. "I almost didn't," I said. I spent 2 hours with her that day. I didn't forgive her. Forgiveness isn't something you can give someone who hasn't actually asked for it or understood what they need to be forgiven for. But I listened to her, actually listened, for the first time since we were children, and I heard beneath the excuses and the narrative something true. My sister was also invisible, but in a different way. She was so busy performing visibility that she never developed the capacity for actual presence. The house sale, the lie about her business struggles, the entire careful construction of who she needed to be, all of it was an extension of the same fundamental problem. Neither of us had ever been taught to be ourselves. We had only been taught to be useful, and Monica had interpreted that as requiring constant performance. Then I went to see my parents. My mother was in the ICU. She had had a minor stroke brought on by the stress of Monica's crisis. My father was sitting beside her bed in a plastic chair, and he looked like a man who had finally run out of narratives to tell himself. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life constructing an elaborate architecture of right answers, and suddenly all the foundations were revealed to be sand. I stood in the doorway and I said nothing. He saw me, and I watched the recognition move through him like something physical. I watched him understand that I had come, that I had traveled 1,200 miles to stand in a hospital room with the people who had stolen from me. And I watched something else happen. He watched me in my professional clothes, with the bearing of a woman who had built something real, and I saw him finally see me the way Abuela had seen me. Not as a solution to his problems, not as leverage in a family dynamic, but as a person, as someone who mattered. "Anna," he said, "just that, just my name." "We need to talk about the house," I said, and my voice was very calm and very clinical, the voice I use in depositions and courtrooms. "We need to talk about the property transfer on November 8, 2019. We need to talk about fraud, about elder abuse, about the fact that you sold an asset that wasn't entirely yours to sell. And we need to talk about why you lied to me for 4 years." He tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand. "I'm not done. I called 14 times. You blocked my numbers. I sent emails. You ignored them. I sent a letter. You returned it unopened. So before you try to tell me your version of why this happened, I want you to understand that I know exactly what happened, and I have the legal documents to prove it." My mother from her hospital bed began to cry, real tears, not performance, and my father put his face in his hands. "I don't want your apologies," I continued. "I don't want your explanations. What I want is for you to understand what you did, fully and completely, without trying to contextualize it or soften it. You stole from me. You lied about it. You cut me off when I asked you to tell the truth. And the only reason we're having this conversation at all is because your crisis has forced the collision of your real life and the lies you were living. I stayed in that hospital room for 3 hours. I didn't touch them. I didn't cry. I did something harder. I stated facts. I detailed the timeline of calls and emails. I explained the legal implications of what they had done. I laid out very precisely the architecture of their betrayal. And slowly, over those 3 hours, the lies began to collapse. Monica had told them that I wouldn't understand the financial pressure they were under, that I was being selfish, that the house sale was a family decision that needed to be made for everyone's good. They had believed her, because believing her was easier than confronting their own involvement in a betrayal. They had told themselves stories about protecting me, about shielding me from financial realities I was too young to understand. I was 22 years old, a legal adult. They had convinced themselves that I would eventually be grateful for their choices. The truth, when it finally emerged, was far more complicated and far more damning. My parents were not villains. They were people who had spent their entire lives teaching their children that worth was conditional, that love had to be earned, that visibility was something you had to perform for. And when Monica performed more convincingly than I did, they chose her. It was the logical conclusion of everything they had taught us. The weeks that followed were not healing. Let me be clear about that. My mother recovered from her stroke, and my father resumed his work. Monica completed her psychiatric hold and entered intensive outpatient programming, and I continued to do what I had learned to do over the previous 4 years. I moved forward. But something changed in the pattern. My mother began writing me letters, not long letters, not letters that tried to explain or excuse, short letters that said things like, "I've been thinking about the conversation you had with your father. I was wrong." And then she would tell me about the one thing she had realized that week. It took months, and the letters were sometimes uncomfortable to read, but they were honest. My father started attending therapy. He called and asked if I had time to talk, and when I said yes, he didn't try to orchestrate the conversation or control the narrative. He just asked me questions. "How have you been? And what was it like building your law practice? And I didn't know you had a mentor named Professor Weinstein. Can you tell me about her?" Monica was harder. She was still learning how to be a person instead of a performance. She was still in therapy, still struggling with the same fundamental emptiness that had driven her to lie and steal. But one day, about 6 months after the hospital crisis, she called me and she said something that felt like progress. "I'm sorry. And I'm not saying that expecting anything from you. I'm saying that because what I did was wrong, and I'm trying to understand why I did it." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. It was just the beginning of honesty. A year after the hospital, I agreed to have dinner with my parents. It wasn't at our old house. That was gone, and neither of us pretended we could recreate something that had been fundamentally broken. It was at a restaurant, neutral ground, and Monica didn't come because she and I needed to rebuild separately before we could rebuild as a family unit. There were 4 place settings at the table. My mother, my father, me, and 1 empty seat, not for someone else, but as a kind of memorial to the people we had been before everything broke. It sounds theatrical when I write it out now, but it didn't feel theatrical when we sat down. It felt necessary. We didn't talk about the house. We talked about small things. My mother asked about my cases. My father told me about a lawyer he had hired to help him work through the restitution I had decided not to pursue. I had realized that money wouldn't repair anything, and prosecuting them wouldn't give me back the years I had lost. I told them about an article I had read. My mother mentioned a book club she had joined. It was stilted and careful, and at one point my father's hand shook as he lifted his water glass. My mother reached over and steadied it, not with words, but with just a small gesture of steadiness, and I thought about architecture. About how the strongest structures aren't the ones that never break. They're the ones that break and are rebuilt with honest recognition of exactly where the fractures occurred. "I want to ask you something," I said as we were finishing. "Why did you come to the hospital when I called? Why did you show up?" "Because Monica needed you," my father said. "That's not good enough," I said, and he flinched, but I continued. "The real answer. Why did you, Ana de Arma, who was cut off and lied to and stolen from, decide to come back?" I thought about this for a long moment. "Because it was the right thing to do," I finally said. And because somewhere under everything, under all the pain and the anger and the years of invisibility, I'm still someone who would rather be a good person than be right. But I need you to understand that I came for Monica, not for you. I came because she was in crisis, and I stayed for myself, to prove to myself that I was capable of walking into that hospital and not falling apart. You being there, you being changed by it, that's something that happened, but it wasn't why I came. My mother reached for my hand then, and I didn't pull away. I want you to know that I see that, she said. I see that you did that completely on your own terms, I see you. And after 4 years of being invisible, of being sold out and lied to and erased, I believed her. Not because the words themselves had magical power, but because they had been earned through her choices, through the slow, difficult work of changing her own behavior. What the house would have been worth if I had kept it, I don't actually know. The market shifted. The property would have been worth less by the time I would have been ready to own it fully. What matters is not the financial value but the metaphorical one. The house was supposed to be proof that I mattered, that I was chosen, that I was visible. And when it was taken from me, I had to learn to create that proof myself. I think that's the terrible gift of betrayal. It forces you to become responsible for your own visibility. It won't let you wait for someone else to see your worth. My parents and I are not perfect now. We are careful with each other in ways that will probably never fully dissolve, but we are also honest with each other in ways that we never were before. And we have built something new in the space where the old structure collapsed, not a restoration of what we had, but an entirely new architecture built on the foundation of truth. My name is Ana de Arma, and I am 27 years old, and I finally understand what my grandmother meant when she said I was an architect. I didn't build buildings or design spaces. I built a life. I designed a future. I constructed the visible proof of my own worth while everyone else was doubting it, and that is something no one can ever take from me again. If you're waiting for your family to see you, stop waiting. See yourself first. That's where everything begins.